I'm Curtis, and today I'm going to show you how to build your very own Lego Les Paul, complete with terrible headstock puns. So the first step is of course going to be creating a design that I can work from. This right here is a tool called Lego Digital Designer. You can find it online, it's free. And what it does is it lets you reach into the store of basically every Lego part that exists and build it up in a 3D model to see what the finished product will look like. And what I'm doing here is I'm just building up the body, and the kind of thing that you want to keep in mind here is you got to make sure that as you build up the layers, as many pieces as possible overlap with each other so that even without adhesive or something like that, you will have a body that sticks together as one solid piece and won't fall apart on you. Now the amazing thing about this tool, first of all, outside the fact that it's free, is that it will let you export a list of all the pieces that you used, and you can just take that list and go buy these pieces one at a time for a penny, 2 pennies. I found out doing this project that the secondhand Lego market is insanely organized, and you can find stores on something like bricklink.com, for example, and just order these piecemeal as you need them. Now you'll notice here that I'm kind of avoiding the middle and just leaving a large cavity there. That's for, I'm planning on putting a block of wood here because I don't think the Lego itself is actually strong enough to hold the string tension. I think more than likely it would collapse under the string tension. It's strong enough to hold itself up, but I think in order to make it playable, I need to make sure that there's wood in the middle there that's just covered by Lego. And you can see as well here that I'm leaving channels throughout the body, for example here in the switch cavity for wiring. That way I don't have to drill it in later. There's no reason for me to have to drill it in later when I can just build it right into the design to leave a channel clear for the Lego. Oh, this is actually one of my favorite things here. I found out while I was doing this that the standard humbucker size is actually basically the perfect size to fit in a rectangle of Lego that's 5 by 9 squares. And that kind of blew my mind, so I'm going to use that to my advantage here and use Lego to hold the pickups in place. And you can kind of see here I'm using a trick that I used when I was trying to build larger shapes that were hard to keep track of. I would draw around it in gray Lego and fill it in, and then I would just delete the gray Lego. Made it a lot easier. And this is the finished product here. You can see I switched out the white color for cream. I added in the binding around the side as best I could. Added in a pick guard with what is supposed to be the metal clip on, and then over here you can see I found 4 gold, I think these are supposed to be wheels, but they are basically the perfect size to use for knobs, and I'm gonna use those just kind of complete the look. And this is the cavity that I was talking about where the wood will be. That'll hold everything in place. It'll hold the strap buttons and the neck. And then of course I realized kind of halfway through that I could actually do the headstock as well while I'm at it. There's no reason why not. This is just kind of there for a visual illusion so I could visualize it. What I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to cut that piece right there in half on a bandsaw because they don't make a piece that has the right angle that I need for this area. But that's covered up by the switch, or by the truss rod cover anyway. So now I've ordered the Lego and it's come in, and I built it once as a dry run just to kind of make sure that it would fit together. I kind of end up regretting that because I didn't realize how much work would go into building it the first time, and then having to build it again on top of that just so I could stick everything together permanently. And it was kind of a bummer. But you live and learn. Next time I will probably just go straight to making sure everything's glued together from the get-go. Alright, now if you're a Lego enthusiast, you should probably look away now. I didn't realize when I started this until I had to go to this stage where I was trying to figure out how to stick everything together that the Lego community at large is very, very anti-gluing Lego together. It was kind of weird, honestly, but to each their own. So what I ended up using is acetone, actually, just a standard nail polish remover you can find at a dollar store. I think I found this for $2. Basically, instead of using glue, I'm actually just melting the top layer of the Lego with a very, very light brushing of acetone, and when I stick the Legos together, the acetone melts the top layer of each piece and just sticks them together, and they fuse and basically become one piece. And so I have not used a single drop of glue yet on this project. This is all acetone. And the best part of acetone is it doesn't leave a sticky mess. Sometimes if it leaks, you might get a little bit of plastic residue and slurry on your desk or on your workspace, but you can actually just clean it up with more acetone and it all goes away like it was never there. It was honestly a pretty enjoyable process. The only thing you want to be careful of is acetone is pretty thin, so it can leak, and if it does that, then what I experienced was I would have it leaking out the bottom, and it would just kind of start to ruin the finish on the bottom. So just be careful of that if you do this. So now that the body's built, I'm going to go ahead and start making this block of wood for the middle that's going to hold the neck. I just made it out of a piece of maple that I got at my local hardwood store. Super cheap, really wasn't much to worry about. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to rip it down to size to the big width, and I'm just going to cut off the corners so that it will fit in the body. And you can see here I'm just testing the fit. Okay, fit's all good, so I'm going to go ahead and start cutting out the corners here to fit inside the cavity. Something you need to know when you're going to do this, each Lego square is 8 millimeters by 8 millimeters. And that is very helpful when you're going to do this. You don't have to measure every single time you do it. I know I'm cutting out two squares by 1 square, and I know that translates to 60 millimeters by 8 millimeters. It's very, very easy to do this calculation in my head. Okay, fits nice and snug, so time to move on to the headstock now. Now the neck I picked up for this project is not the greatest. You can kind of see, even just looking at it, just eyeballing it, you can see how lopsided the head is. I was kind of warned about this in the reviews of when I was buying it, so I'm not that surprised. But the neck feels great, and I think it looks fine. The frets are in the right spots and everything, so I'm going to go ahead and use it. Luckily, I'm planning on modifying the headstock anyway, so it's not that big of a deal for my project. But just be, careful of that whenever you're buying a neck off of some random no-name site. But for my purposes, this is just fine. First things first, I'm going to drill out these holes, plug them up with some dowel, and glue that up, and then we'll take care of the shape of the headstock after that. Now this process is pretty straightforward, but one thing I do want to mention, you want to make sure that these holes are nice and perpendicular to the face of the headstock. The easiest way for you to do that is to make sure that the headstock is on something flat. The problem is that the nut, since it's already attached, is going to get in the way of doing this. So what I'm doing is I'm putting the headstock on a piece of 1/2 inch MDF, and the nut is kind of just sitting at the edge of the MDF, and so that way the headstock is nice and flat and perpendicular to the drill, and the nut's not going to get in the way. And you'll see that process again later when I start cutting into the headstock and to reshape it. So not much interesting to see here, I don't think. Just typical putting glue on a dowel and putting it in a hole. The only thing I think might be interesting here is just notice that I'm using flat blocks to try and make sure that the dowel is as close as possible to level on the back. The reason for this is that in the next part, I'm going to try and take material off the front to make it thinner so that I can put a Lego veneer over top of it. And for that to work out, it's really ideal that the back needs to be as flat as possible first, and making sure that these dowels aren't sticking out is the easiest way for me to do that. And so you can see here, this is what I was talking about. I used the same trick here of putting the face of the headstock on a piece of MDF, using the nut actually to hold it nice and square, and that way I could just use my chop saw and just cut a nice clean line down. It doesn't actually matter that that line is square, all that matters is that it's flat, because I'm going to cut it out anyway. And you can actually see here that I'm using the same trick of keeping something flat against the back while I'm doing this glue up, and that's going to make sure that even though I'm using several pieces to make this headstock, the back of it stays nice and level, and that's going to help me make sure that the front is nice and level and also parallel to the back in the next step when I'm taking material off the front. And so you can see here again, I've put this headstock just on a piece of MDF just for support, make sure it's nice and flat, square, level, and then I cut into it with the chop saw, just fastest way to get this job done. And again, there's the MDF coming out, make sure everything is nice and level. And look, yeah, I know you're not supposed to glue end grain to end grain, it's fine. There's really not any load that joint is going to have to be bearing. It's really just going to be for show. Nothing's actually going to be putting stress on that joint, so I don't think it's going to end up being a problem. And this way the grain matches, honestly, was really the driving decision behind that. And so here it is, I've cut off the excess that I don't need, and I'm going to use, this is just a pin router that I made up real quick after watching one of Texas Toast's videos. He inspired me to make my own pin router, which is probably a bad idea, but it does this job pretty well. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the back, which again I made sure to stay nice and level, and I'm going to just fix that to an elevated piece of MDF. Reason being that the neck has such a steep headstock angle that I need to make sure that I have enough clearance to not just hit the edge of the pin router while I do this. And yeah, so the pin router, if you're not familiar, it holds the router above the piece and then is raised and lowered from there. And what I'm doing here is I'm basically using it like a router sled in which the piece moves rather than the router, and that gives me a lot of freedom to have a neck angle like this. I don't think I would have been able to get away with this in a router sled, but on the pin router it's just fine. And all I'm doing is I'm taking multiple passes, taking off half a millimeter at a time, just till I get down to the point where there's enough material being removed from the face that I can put a Lego veneer over top of this and make sure the strings aren't going to come into contact with that and ruin, you know, the tuning and whatnot. And so I'm steering clear of the nut. I'm just going to clean that up later with a saw and not have to worry about, you know, just accidentally routing my nut away. But aside from that, this process worked out almost better than I expected. And the headstock came out, you know, still strong enough to hold everything, and just thick enough that I can put the Lego veneer on. And this is just a template that I 3D printed that is the exact shape that the Legos will take on, and I'm going to use that as a guide for cutting out on the bandsaw, and I'm also going to use that as a router guide so that I can just use a flush trim bit and clean up the wood that's left over from the bandsaw. So now the neck's basically ready to go. The next step is going to be starting to prepare the body to accept the hardware. The thing about Lego guitars is that, you know, even though the Lego fits a pickup pretty well, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to conform to where the bridge goes very well. And so I have to drill all those holes by hand. And the other problem is, since I made this faceplate 4 or 5 layers thick at some spots of plate Legos, it's actually too thick for me to put a the bridge pin in and have it actually sit up above the Lego. And so my solution to that is just, I'm drilling these pilot holes here so that I know where they're supposed to be. And what I'm going to do afterwards is I'm going to cut out a hole with a boring bit, and I'm just going to put dowel in there, and the dowel should be strong enough to hold the bridge pins and the tailpiece, and that will actually let me create kind of an elevated area where I only have one layer of Lego and the rest actually below that is just wood, and that kind of lets me cheat so that I can get the bridge pins in and have it sit the correct height above the Lego. Yeah, and so now with the holes bored in the wood, I'm now going to start cutting them out of the Lego. You'll notice here that I left off the very, very top layer of yellow Lego so that I don't mar it. I want to make sure that that basically looks as close to perfect as possible. I have, however, used, you can kind of see here, these small yellow pieces off to the edges. What those are doing, they're there to mark where I'm supposed to be drilling these holes. It's one of the easiest ways for me to remember where everything goes, because when you're staring at a grid like this without a really easy way to mark things, it's really easy to lose your place. And the guiding Legos really help me keep on track. And this is, again, just some guides that I printed on a 3D printer. These are gonna be the perfect size for me to put my neck into this cavity, and basically it functions the same as it did on the headstock. I'm going to use it to guide me on the bandsaw, and then I'm going to use it as a template on the router just to kind of clean up whatever the bandsaw didn't get. Okay, and now we're ready to do glue up. Really not that surprising here, I don't think. The only thing that I would say here is because there's a roughly 3-degree angle in the neck, I do need to add these shims in so that I can make sure that I'm not leaving any gaps where I don't want them. But other than that, it was pretty straightforward. Just put some glue on, clamp it up, and let it sit. And now it's time to laminate that Lego veneer I was talking about on the headstock. For this I used a 2-part epoxy that you can buy at basically any hardware store. And I'm just putting it on here. Nice thick coat on the headstock, nice thick coat on the Lego. And I'm using another set of kind of larger Legos. Since this one is made up of so many small pieces, those larger Legos will help keep it in place. Make sure that nothing's shifting around on me that I don't want it to. It'll also give me a nice place to put a clamp and kind of make sure I'm getting nice even pressure. And also, it's easier to remove later. It's Lego. There's no epoxy on those, so I can just peel them off and not worry about it. And while that's drying, time to move on to start to red out the pickup cavities here. Now, one thing I learned, which I probably should have guessed but didn't, is that Lego does not machine very well. It's not terrible, but it doesn't like to cut. It'll generally try to either splinter or melt, is what I found. So I had to make very, very short trips in with the router, I guess is the word I'm looking for. Because the longer I stayed in there, the more likely it was going to melt instead of kind of stay this fluffy texture. And it took me a couple of tries to kind of figure that out, that you really can't stay in all that long with the router. And if you want to make your life easier. And so that's what I'm doing here, is I just take short passes and then I vacuum it out, and that way things kind of stay roughly tidy adjacent. And now I just kind of drilled the holes for the bridge pins and for the tailpiece. And you can kind of see here I didn't do a great job of centering the dowels, but it's not the end of the world. And yeah, we're almost done. Time for some paint. And look, okay, look. I know. My painting technique leaves something to be desired. Please don't make fun of me. I'm still working on it. It'll come eventually. I am not particularly gifted with spray paint. So hopefully you're not taking your spray painting advice from me. Yeah, I would probably follow other people's advice. And once this is done, it's time to move on to a coat of 2K clear coat from Spray Max. This stuff is amazing. Dries really fast, dries really hard. And after that, it's basically done. Just pop it together, wire it up, and give it a test drive. And that's it. Take it on down to your local guitar store and start selling. Hope you liked this video. If you did, hopefully you can subscribe. If you didn't, subscribe anyway. What are you going to do? What do you got to lose? It costs you nothing. Hopefully you stick around and see what else is coming up. And I'll see you next time.